I'm sure you know this flag, the flag of the United Nations. It's one of the most well-known flags in the world, and it's been the main symbol of the UN since 1947. But the UN was actually founded 2 years before this, in 1945. Does this mean that the most significant international organization in history had no flag for its first 2 years of operation? Not exactly. When the UN was officially founded, with the signing of the UN Charter in San Francisco, a lot of people considered this to be the flag of the United Nations. Don't believe me? Here's a picture of this flag being flown in Washington, D.C. in the 1940s at the UN Information Center, then known as the UN Service Center. Here's a picture of the flag at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington Cemetery on Memorial Day, 1944. And here's a picture of the flag being flown at a Major League Baseball game in 1947. This is at Griffith Stadium, then the home of the Washington Senators, the forerunners of today's Washington Nationals. But unlike the UN flag of today, I'm betting most people watching this video will have never seen this red and white flag before. Is this the lost flag of the United Nations? Yes, it is. Maybe. Sort of. I'll explain. Stay tuned. Hi everyone, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and this video is about a flag mystery that's been bugging me for many, many years. But I think I may have finally solved it. Maybe. You be the judge. The mystery began many, many years ago when I visited a library and I came across a copy of this book, the World Flag Encyclopedia, published in 1948. If I'm honest, I found it one of the most baffling books that I've ever read in my entire life. I first became interested in flags as a young kid, so by the time I encountered this book, I thought that I knew all of the important flags from world history, but this book was telling me that I was wrong. Despite the title, it's a book about just one flag, a flag called the United Nations Honor Flag. And as I read through the detailed history provided and looked at the extensive collection of photographs, I couldn't help but conclude that this flag is one of the most historically important flags of the 20th century. Except it can't be, can it? Because hardly anyone has ever heard of it. So how do we explain this book, published nearly 80 years ago? Was this flag ever really used by the UN? And if so, why is it forgotten today? Is it an artifact from an alternative reality that slipped through a wormhole somehow? Trust me, this book is totally baffling. Because it was a library book, I had to return it before long, and I didn't see another copy for a long time, but I always wondered about this flag, and about this odd book I've read about it in. A few years ago, I discovered there was a copy at the London School of Economics library, but it was accessible only to LSE students. The National Library of Scotland has a copy that the public can read, but that's an 8-hour drive away. And then I found this copy, which is also a former library book, for sale online, and I snapped it up immediately. So now I finally have my own copy of the World Flag Encyclopedia, all world and regional flags featuring honor flag development 1942 to 1947. And being a bit older and maybe a bit wiser than I was when I first read it, I think I figured the mystery out. I think I know why the UN honor flag, which arguably was the very first flag of the United Nations, is now today almost completely forgotten. Before we do anything else though, I think it would be good if I presented the history of the UN honor flag as it is presented in this book. It all starts with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. During his State of the Union address in January 1941, FDR declared that everyone in the world should have freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Together, these were known as the Four Freedoms. Whether or not you think it's the government's job to provide all four of these freedoms, I think we can say pretty safely that these are four things that pretty much everyone in the world would want. And they also neatly encapsulate Roosevelt's optimistic and progressive worldview. Later that same year, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. entered World War II, and bringing the four freedoms to everyone worldwide became central to America's publicly stated war aims. On New Year's Day, 1942, less than a month after the U.S. entered the war, representatives from nations known as the Big Four, the U.S., the U.K., the Soviet Union, and China, signed a document known as the Declaration by United Nations. This wasn't the founding of the UN that we know and love today. This was the founding of a group known as the Allied Powers, the group of nations that fought together against the Axis powers during the war. This name for the Allies, United Nations, is now largely forgotten, and I guess mostly because it's sort of confusing to talk about the Allies as the United Nations when today we have this other organization called the United Nations. But officially, that's what the Allies were called, the United Nations, as illustrated in this very famous wartime poster. And in many ways, and as you'll see during the course of this video, the UN that we have today is more or less a sort of extension of the Allied powers from World War II. And if you need an example of this, how that's played out over time, just look at who the permanent members of the Security Council are. They're basically the victorious powers from World War II. The signing of the Declaration by United Nations was big news, of course, and caught the attention of the man who is the hero in our story, one Brooks Harding, a maker of novelty furniture from Gloversville, New York. And before you ask, I have no idea what novelty furniture is. If you know and you think it won't get your account banned, let me know in the comments. The Allies were primarily a military alliance, but Roosevelt being Roosevelt, he portrayed the Allies as a group of like-minded countries working together for global freedom. And he encouraged Americans to fly the flags of the various Allied nations to show their support. There were dozens of member nations in the Allies in total, though, and flying so many flags was impractical for ordinary people. So our friend, novelty furniture maker Brooks Harding, came up with a solution. A single flag that would show support for all of the Allies, all of the United Nations. According to the book, Harding created a series of flag designs based on Roosevelt's four freedoms, and during a visit to Washington for business, he dropped them off at the U.S. State Department, which, in case you don't know, is what the American Foreign Ministry is called. An unnamed official there received the flags, told Harding he thought it was a great idea, but then said, unfortunately, there was no one in charge of this sort of thing. Perhaps Mr. Harding would like to take the job on himself. And that's exactly what he did. Harding started presenting himself at the Washington embassies of all the Allied nations, showing them his flag designs and trying to form a consensus about which design would be best. One design represented the four freedoms with four red stripes for the main part of the flag and four vertical bars on white in the canton. During a visit to the Czechoslovakian embassy, Harding got into an extended conversation with the Czechoslovakian First Secretary, a Dr. Vladimir Palic. While they spoke, Palic picked up this striped flag, folded it, and then placed it on his desk, with only the canton showing. Upon seeing this more streamlined version of the flag, Dr. Palic declared, "There, Mr. Harding, is your flag." And so, the UN Honor Flag was born. It was announced to the world in an Associated Press story on November 9, 1942, and a United Nations Honor Flag Committee was formed at Washington's Mayflower Hotel on December 21st. After much deliberation, its first official use took place on June 13, 1943, at a ceremony at Meridian Hill Park in Washington, conducted by the American Legion, an organization for retired U.S. soldiers. A week later, it was raised, prophetically perhaps, at Dumbarton Oaks Estate. I say prophetically because, as many of you may know, in 1944, Dumbarton Oaks was the site of the discussions between the Allied powers where they negotiated the creation of the international organization, the United Nations, the one that exists today. And over time, the UN Honor Flag began appearing in more and more places, and it wasn't just embraced by Americans. Here it is being displayed next to the guest registration book at the Canadian Embassy, and the book also includes examples of the design being used by the British and the Free French forces. And this picture I remember clearly from when I read this book the first time, and it really convinced me that the UN Honor Flag was a piece of lost history. Here are planes being prepared for the Normandy invasion in 1944 with the UN Honor Flag symbol painted on the fuselage. Right? Actually, I'm sure some viewers will have seen that picture and spotted that something's not quite right there. That's not what those stripes are. And the book doesn't actually clearly state that that's the UN honor flag symbol on the planes. It just sort of implies that. And here we can see that the book is playing a bit fast and loose with facts. But anyway, let's carry on. Representatives from the Allied nations gathered in San Francisco in April 1945 to officially launch the United Nations, as in the international organization. UN honor flags were displayed throughout the city, and the San Francisco Press Club integrated the flag's design into the press cards they distributed to journalists for the occasion. And when the first official meetings of the United Nations took place later that year, they took place in front of 4 pillars, evoking Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, and, of course, the UN honor flag. The war officially ended in the summer of 1945, and with soldiers demobilizing and everyone excited about peace, use of the UN honor flag was becoming more and more established, and not just in America. The book describes the usage of the UN honor flag in 18 countries in total. And by the way, the recommended way for people to show the world their support for the UN and its goals was to fly a half-sized UN honor flag underneath their own national flag, or, if they had the space, a full-size version alongside their national flag on the right. But there was a problem, at least according to the book. The UN's role was to do more than just celebrate global friendship. It was meant to ensure peace, possibly by sending in military forces to do this, and this action might not be popular with the local population. It would be wrong for the UN honor flag, which represents peace and global goodwill, to be used at the front of a military occupation force. So a second flag was needed for the UN's more official and potentially unpopular activities, a flag of authority, or a UN organization flag. This was first used in 1947 during a UN mission to the Balkans and was formally adopted later the same year. And so, as of 1948, when this book was written, there are 2 UN flags. There's the UN honor flag, for when you, as a private citizen, want to express your feelings of harmony for the rest of the world, and the UN organization flag, which is used by the UN in its official capacity, when it has to do very important but not always very popular work. And so the book ends, and as a reader, it's very hard not to conclude that something went terribly wrong during the years following 1948. And that somehow the UN honor flag, once so beloved, was inadvertently overshadowed by the new UN blue flag and accidentally dropped from history. This article from the Washington Post from 2016 seems to confirm this version of events, calling the honor flag the most famous flag you've never heard of, and explaining how the honor flag became a curious footnote. Is that what happened? Well, reading this book again, many years later, I get the impression that while this book goes to great lengths to present the UN honor flag as a sort of mass popular movement of global goodwill that is embraced by people all around the world, that in actual fact, the UN honor flag was being promoted by a fairly small number of people. In fact, really one person, our friend Brooks Harding. And if you reread the book with this suspicion in mind, the whole thing becomes a lot easier to understand. For example, when Harding showed up unannounced at the U.S. State Department with his flag designs, did an unnamed official really encourage him, an unknown man who just walked off the street, to start canvassing embassies for their opinions on his designs? Or did they just encourage him to go somewhere else to get rid of him? After all, in October 1942, there was a war to fight. And while I don't doubt that the photographs in the book are real, or that the flag was occasionally adopted in an unofficial capacity by organizations in the broader UN ecosystem, like the UN Service Center or the UN Club in Washington, it's easy to imagine that one very energetic and determined person could have arranged this. Hey, American Legion guys, would you carry this flag in your event today? Hey ladies, can I put this flag on the counter in your store and take a picture of you? Hey kid, can you hold this flag for a moment? I may be being overly skeptical here, but there's no doubt that many of the most important proof claims in this book are, at best, misleading. First of all, the flying of the flag at Dumbarton Oaks, that was a private meeting of what sounds like a social club that, along with ordinary citizens, included some diplomats from allied nations. It wasn't an official event, and I suspect Harding just managed to get an invitation and brought his flag along. Then there were the 4-pillar designs on the fuselages of the planes preparing for the Normandy invasion. Except, if you look closely, those aren't 4 white stripes. There are 3 white stripes and 2 black ones. And if you know your World War II history, you may know that these were called invasion stripes. They were placed on Allied planes as identifiers to avoid friendly fire. Yes, there were occasions when there were 4 white stripes. Here's an example. But officially, planes were meant to display 5 black and white stripes. This had nothing to do with Roosevelt's 4 freedoms or the UN honor flag. And how about those 4 columns used as the backdrops for the early UN meetings in San Francisco? First of all, they were golden columns, not red, and they were a backdrop for the UN when it met in San Francisco's Memorial Opera House. I can't say for sure, but I suspect the golden columns in the Opera House were just decorative, and what looks like a resemblance to the honor flag design, especially in these black and white photos, is a coincidence. A coincidence that Brooks Harding was happy to seize upon. Another disingenuous presentation of facts, in my opinion, is the account of the 2 UN flags, the honor flag and the organization flag. I don't think there was any official deliberation for 2 different use cases for these flags. I think what happened is that Harding wanted his flag to become the official UN flag, and when that failed, I think he retconned this explanation for why there should be another UN flag alongside his. In fact, in January 1947, when it became clear that his original design wasn't going to be accepted as the official UN flag, he even proposed this compromise design. But I'm not at all convinced that anyone in charge at the UN was paying attention to Harding or the UN Honor Flag Committee, which was not an official organization. It's just something that Harding put together and sort of created himself. It's also possible that people running the UN at the time weren't even aware of any of these efforts. The flag did enjoy some use in the US, especially in the Washington area, but the examples of its use in other countries are very thin. For example, quote, "A Polish official but recently returned from Poland informs the committee that the honor flag has been used in Poland." Or, "Honor flags have been shipped to Beirut according to the Lebanese legation in Washington, but there is no information as to their use." Perhaps the saddest entry of this sort came from within Washington itself. Upon request, the honor flag was delivered to the White House in 1943 and was returned with a note stating that the president had seen the flag. No comment was requested and none was made by the president. All of this, especially that last entry, which I find kind of heartbreaking, makes me think that Harding was just delivering UN honor flags to as many people as he could in a desperate attempt to try and get the flag adopted. But no one was really interested, and all he got back were letters written in polite language in order to spare his feelings. Was it the concept of the flag they didn't like? I don't think that's the issue. There probably was a desire among some people for a universal flag of peace and harmony during and just after World War II. But by the start of the Korean War in 1950, just 2 years after this book was published, that sentiment of goodwill among the former Allied powers was long gone. Then there is the aesthetic issue. This book plays up the fact that the UN honor flag is very unique and could never be mistaken for one of the various national flags of the world. And I guess that's a good thing, but maybe that's because nobody else wanted their national flag to look anything like this flag. I want you to tell me in the comments what your first impression of the UN honor flag was. I gotta be honest, my first impression was not really very positive. According to the Washington Post article I shared before, after the war, Harding settled in Washington. Now more interested in flags and novelty furniture, he started a flag rental business. When Queen Elizabeth came to D.C. in 1957, he supplied the Union Jacks used in the National Cathedral for her visit. He also produced this book, which, now that I look at it, seems to have been self-published. And I bet he paid for it with his own money. I also think, and I'm not sure about this, but I think the only reason you'll ever find copies of this book in libraries, or ex-library copies like this one, is because when no one bought his book, Harding probably posted every copy he had to various libraries around the world. And I find this all kind of tragic. I suspect Harding was probably a very talented person, but also maybe a very frustrated person. Someone who wanted to make his mark on history, but fell short. And that was probably very difficult to take. I have a lot of sympathy for that. But he did seem to really care about this flag. That's obvious on every page of this book. And in lots of ways, he did come close to success. He managed to get a lot of national publicity for it, and he got it to fly at a Major League Baseball game for much of the season. Those accomplishments are not nothing. Harding died in 1959 and is buried in Arlington Cemetery. And the next time I'm in Washington, I'll try to stop by and pay my respects. Thanks for watching. I'd really like to know what you think of this flag, the UN honor flag, both aesthetically, like I was saying before, but also, do you think the idea of such a flag that's like sort of unofficial, not the official UN flag, but a flag that represents world peace and brotherhood of man, is that something that's useful? Is that something that we should resurrect today, do you think? Also, while I was making this video, I discovered that this book that I've been searching for years and years and years was uploaded to the Internet Archive in 2023. So now actually you can go and read it yourself for free. I've left a link in the pinned comment of this video. Go check it out. Let me know what you think. And I'll see you guys in the next video.